Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Wildlife Legends and don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments. The Arctic wind howled through the endless expanse of ice, carrying with it a cruel, biting cold that turned breath to frost in mere seconds. The sky was an endless sheet of gray, blending seamlessly with the snow-covered landscape, making it impossible to distinguish where the earth ended and the heavens began. It was the kind of cold that didn't just freeze, it consumed. In the midst of this frozen wilderness, barely visible against the vast white void, a small lump of fur trembled, half buried in the snow. A polar bear cub, no older than a few weeks, lay motionless, its frail body shuddering with every struggling breath. Its mother was nowhere in sight. Had she abandoned it? Or had something even worse happened? The cub's tiny chest rose and fell unevenly, its once fluffy white fur now stiff with ice. Its whimpers were weak, so weak that even the wind seemed to swallow them whole. It was starving, freezing, and utterly alone. Somewhere in the vast, unforgiving tundra, the ice was shifting. A storm was brewing, its eerie whisper growing louder. If help didn't arrive soon, the cub wouldn't last the night. Miles away, trudging through the relentless Arctic storm, was a man. Wrapped in layers of insulated gear, his breath fogged up the inside of his fur-lined hood as he pressed forward, his snow boots crunching through the ice. His name was Jack Holloway, a wildlife researcher who had dedicated his life to studying Arctic predators. But today, he wasn't just a scientist. Today, he was fate's last roll of the dice for one dying cub. Jack had been tracking a polar bear family for weeks, monitoring their migration patterns as the ice continued to shrink at alarming rates. But something had changed. The mother bear he had been observing, strong, protective, fiercely devoted to her cub, had vanished. Her GPS tracker had stopped transmitting 2 days ago. And that's when Jack's gut had twisted with a feeling he couldn't shake. Something was wrong. He had spent the last 12 hours trekking through brutal conditions, retracing the mother bear's last known path. His supplies were running low, the wind had stolen all feeling from his fingers, and the ice beneath his feet creaked ominously, reminding him that one wrong step could mean plunging into the freezing abyss below. But then, he saw it. At first, it looked like a mere mound of snow. But as he squinted against the wind, his heart clenched. It wasn't snow. It was a cub. Barely alive. Jack's instincts kicked in before logic could protest. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the trembling ball of fur. Gently, he placed a gloved hand on its tiny body. It was ice cold to the touch. The cub barely reacted. "Hey, little one," Jack murmured, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Come on, don't give up on me now." He had seen polar bear cubs before, but never like this. Never this fragile. Never this close to death. His mind raced. If the mother was gone, the cub had no chance of survival. Even if it lasted another night, the Arctic had a merciless way of claiming the weak. Jack reached into his pack, pulling out an emergency thermal blanket. Wrapping the cub carefully, he held it close to his chest, letting his own body warmth seep through the layers. But time was running out. A storm was closing in. And then, the ice beneath him cracked. A sound like a deep, thunderous growl echoed through the tundra. Jack stiffened. He knew that sound all too well. The ice was breaking. He didn't have much time. Lifting the cub in his arms, Jack turned and ran, his boots slipping on the unstable ground. The frozen landscape beneath him trembled, as if warning him that one misstep could send him plunging into the abyss. But just as he thought he had made it to safer ground, he saw something that made his blood run colder than the wind itself. Just beyond the white horizon, half hidden by the storm, a dark shadow loomed. Something was watching him. Something massive. And it was moving toward him. Jack's breath hitched as the shadow moved closer, its massive form barely visible through the swirling snow. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body remained frozen, his mind racing through the terrifying possibilities. A fully grown polar bear? If it was the cub's mother, why hadn't she responded earlier? And if it wasn't, Jack's grip on the fragile cub tightened. Then, the shadow emerged. A polar bear, large, imposing, its thick white coat blending perfectly with the landscape, stared at him. But something was wrong. It was limping. Deep scars slashed across its powerful frame, fresh wounds staining the pristine snow beneath its paws. Its movements were slow, labored, each step carrying a weight beyond just physical pain. Jack knew what this meant. The mother bear had fought. And she had lost. His heart clenched as the realization sank in. This was the cub's mother, barely clinging to life. The bear took another shaky step forward before collapsing onto the ice with a deep, rumbling groan. Jack didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, kneeling beside the massive creature. Up close, he could see the extent of her injuries, claw marks, deep bites. This wasn't the work of a human. It was another bear. A male. A rogue male had attacked her, likely trying to kill the cub, something male polar bears often did to eliminate competition for resources. And the mother had fought with everything she had. Jack swallowed hard, glancing between the dying mother and the shivering cub in his arms. The wind howled around them, as if mourning the tragedy unfolding on the ice. The mother's dark eyes flickered open, locking onto him. There was no aggression, no fear. Just exhaustion. She exhaled, her breath misting in the freezing air. And then, she did something Jack never expected. She nudged the cub. Jack barely breathed as he watched the massive bear, broken and bleeding, push her nose against her baby, her strength fading with every second. She was saying goodbye. Jack felt something tighten in his chest, an emotion too raw to name. The cub whimpered, reaching for its mother with tiny, trembling paws. Jack knew what was coming. He had seen it before in the wild, the moment when an animal surrenders to fate. But knowing didn't make it any easier. The mother bear gave one final, labored breath, and then, her body stilled. Jack closed his eyes. The wind screamed around him, but all he could hear was silence. The cub let out a soft, pitiful cry, nudging its mother's unmoving form. But she didn't respond. She never would again. Jack inhaled sharply. He didn't have the luxury of grief, not now. The storm was closing in, and he was standing on unstable ice with a helpless cub in his arms. He had to move. But as he turned, preparing to leave, something made him stop. A sound. Low. Deep. Unmistakable. A growl. And it wasn't coming from the mother. Jack's blood turned to ice. He wasn't alone. Through the thick, swirling snow, another shadow moved. This one was bigger, more powerful, its steps deliberate. Jack didn't need to guess. The rogue male. The bear that had done this. And now, it had found them. Jack's heartbeat pounded in his ears as he clutched the cub tighter. He had no weapon, no defense. If the male charged, he wouldn't stand a chance. The predator took another step forward, its golden eyes locking onto Jack's. It wasn't just looking at him. It was hunting him. Jack had seconds to decide. And in those seconds, something happened that he never, in his wildest nightmares, could have imagined. The ice beneath his feet cracked. And then, it collapsed. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs as the world beneath him gave way. The ice groaned, split, then shattered into a deadly void of freezing black water. And then, he was falling. The polar bear cub in his arms let out a sharp cry as they plunged into the abyss. The cold was indescribable, a vicious, suffocating force that swallowed him whole. It wasn't just freezing, it was death itself, wrapping its icy fingers around his lungs, squeezing the air from his chest. Jack's survival instincts kicked in, his arms tightening around the cub as he fought against the numbing shock. He kicked hard, forcing himself toward the surface, his heavy gear dragging him down. The cub. His mind screamed at him. He couldn't lose it. He couldn't let it sink. Through sheer willpower, he broke through the surface, gasping for air as the Arctic wind slashed across his soaked face. The cub clung to him, shivering violently, its tiny claws digging into his coat. Above him, standing on the fractured ice, was the rogue male. It loomed over the hole, its massive paws gripping the edge, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Jack knew what was coming next. The bear wasn't going to wait. It was going to finish what it started. Panic surged through him. His muscles were locking up, the icy water stealing his ability to move. If he didn't get out now, he never would. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jack reached for the ice, gripping its slick, unstable surface. He tried to hoist himself up, but his soaked gloves slipped, his body too heavy with the weight of the freezing water. The rogue bear took a step closer. Jack knew he had seconds before those massive jaws came down on him. Then, something unexpected happened. A deep, rumbling groan echoed across the ice. The male bear stopped. It lifted its head, nostrils flaring, eyes flicking away from Jack towards something beyond the blizzard. Jack didn't dare breathe. Something was out there. Then, another sound. Louder this time. Closer. Jack turned his head, squinting through the icy haze. At first, he saw nothing but white. But then, a shadow. No. Several shadows. Moving fast. Jack's blood ran cold. Wolves. A pack of them. Charging straight toward them. The rogue bear let out a low snarl, stepping back from the ice hole, its attention shifting from Jack to the approaching threat. Jack didn't waste another second. He gritted his teeth, reached for his ice axe, his frozen fingers barely able to grip it, and slammed it into the ice. With sheer desperation, he pulled himself up, his body screaming in protest. One arm. Then the other. The cub clung to his chest, too weak to even cry. Jack threw himself onto the ice, rolling away from the water's edge just as the rogue bear turned back toward him, its momentary distraction over. But now, there was another problem. The wolves were here. Jack pushed himself up onto shaking legs, his vision swimming from exhaustion and cold. The lead wolf, a massive, dark-furred alpha, locked eyes with him. The rogue bear let out a growl, its posture shifting, muscles tensing. Jack could see it in its eyes. It was choosing whether to fight. Jack's heart pounded. If the wolves attacked, it would be a battle unlike anything he had ever seen. And if he was caught in the middle, he wouldn't survive. Then, something even more shocking happened. The alpha wolf didn't attack. Instead, it bowed its head. Jack's breath caught in his throat. What the hell was happening? The rogue bear hesitated, eyes flicking between the wolves and Jack. It let out a slow, frustrated huff, then, to Jack's utter disbelief, it turned and walked away. Jack didn't move. He barely even breathed. He had just witnessed something no scientist would believe. A lone rogue bear choosing to walk away from a kill. And a wolf pack showing submission, not to the bear. To him. Jack swallowed hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. The wolves lingered for a moment longer, their eyes unreadable. Then, as silently as they had come, they turned and vanished into the storm. Leaving Jack alone. With a barely alive polar bear cub in his arms. And no explanation for what had just happened. Jack didn't move for a long moment. The freezing wind howled through the Arctic wasteland, but all he could hear was the frantic pounding of his own heartbeat. The rogue bear was gone. The wolves had vanished. And yet, he was still here. Alive. Somehow. The tiny weight in his arms stirred, pulling him back to reality. The cub was barely conscious, its small body trembling violently against his soaked jacket. Jack tightened his grip. The little one didn't have much time. Neither did he. His limbs were stiff, his fingers numb. The cold was sinking into his bones, threatening to take him under just like the ice had. He needed warmth. Shelter. Now. Jack turned, forcing himself to move. Each step was agony, his boots crunching against the ice as he fought against exhaustion. The storm was getting worse. The sky had darkened, thick snow falling in relentless sheets, making it nearly impossible to see. Jack had planned to return to his base camp, just a few miles south. But now, with the blizzard closing in and his body shutting down, that wasn't an option. He had to find shelter. And fast. Then, he saw it. A dark shape in the distance. A ridge of ice and rock jutting from the frozen landscape. A cave. Jack didn't think, he just ran. Each step sent sharp jolts of pain through his frozen limbs, but he didn't stop. The cub whimpered in his arms, barely clinging to life. He reached the cave just as his legs nearly gave out beneath him. It wasn't deep, just a small hollow carved into the ice. But it was enough. Jack stumbled inside, collapsing to his knees. The wind outside screamed against the entrance, but in here, it was quieter. Safer. His fingers fumbled with his backpack, pulling out the emergency thermal blanket. He wrapped the cub first, tucking its tiny form against his chest. Then, with shaking hands, he reached for his fire kit. The flint struck against the metal. Once. Twice. The third time, a spark caught. Within minutes, a small flame flickered to life. Jack positioned himself close, shielding both himself and the cub from the cold. The heat wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them from freezing. For now. Jack exhaled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The reality of what had just happened crashed over him all at once. He had fallen through the ice. He had come face to face with a rogue male bear. He had survived. And the wolves. What the hell had that been? Jack had worked in the Arctic for years. He had seen wolves hunt in packs. He had witnessed their intelligence, their strategy. But this. They hadn't attacked. They hadn't even challenged the rogue bear. They had looked at him. And then, they had bowed. Jack shook his head. He didn't have the energy to make sense of it now. His priority was the cub. Carefully, he peeled back the thermal blanket to check on it. The little one was breathing, barely. Its fur was still damp, its tiny body weak from the cold. Jack knew the odds. Without its mother's milk, the cub wouldn't survive for long. It was too young to eat solid food. Jack clenched his jaw. There had to be a way. He reached into his bag, searching for anything that might help. His fingers closed around a small metal flask. Hot chocolate. It wasn't ideal, but it was warm, and it was something. Jack unscrewed the lid, dipping his fingers into the warm liquid. Carefully, he pressed them to the cub's mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the tiniest flicker of movement. The cub licked the warmth from his skin. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. It was still fighting. And as long as it was fighting, so would he. Outside, the blizzard raged on, consuming the Arctic in an endless storm of ice and wind. But inside the cave, beneath the flickering glow of a fragile fire, a man and a dying cub held on to hope. Together. Jack sat with his back against the frozen cave wall, his arms wrapped protectively around the tiny cub. The fire flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows against the icy walls. The warmth was minimal, but it was enough to keep them both alive, for now. The cub stirred slightly in his grip, its small body still trembling. Jack ran a hand gently over its damp fur, his chest tightening. It was hanging on, but just barely. Outside, the blizzard roared on, a merciless force that threatened to swallow them whole. The wind screamed against the cave walls, shaking the ice and sending sharp gusts of snow through the narrow entrance. Jack glanced toward the opening. Visibility was non-existent. There was no way he could navigate back to base camp in this storm, not without getting lost or freezing to death. He was trapped. And so was the cub. Jack exhaled, his breath a cloud of mist in the cold air. His body was still recovering from the brutal shock of the icy water. His fingers ached, his muscles stiff. He needed warmth. He needed food. But more than that, the cub needed a miracle. Jack rummaged through his pack again, checking his supplies. A few protein bars, a nearly empty thermos, a flare gun, and a hunting knife. Not much. His stomach twisted. The cub needed nourishment, real nourishment. It was too young to digest solid food. Without its mother's milk, its chances were slim. Jack clenched his jaw. There had to be something. Then, an idea hit him. He grabbed the thermos and unscrewed the lid. Inside was the last of his coffee, hot, rich, loaded with milk. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Jack hesitated for only a second before dipping his fingers into the warm liquid, then gently touching them to the cub's mouth. At first, there was no reaction. Then, slowly, weakly, the cub's tiny tongue flicked out, lapping at the warm droplets. Jack held his breath, watching, waiting. The cub licked again. And again. Hope flickered in Jack's chest like the fragile fire beside them. For the first time since finding the little one, he saw a will to live. Jack continued feeding it, little by little, careful not to overwhelm its tiny system. The cub's breathing steadied, its trembling less severe. It wasn't much. But it was enough. For now. Jack leaned his head back against the ice, exhaustion threatening to pull him under. His body was screaming for rest, but his mind wouldn't shut off. The wolves. The rogue bear. The way they had reacted. Something wasn't right. Jack had seen predators in the Arctic before, he knew how they worked. But this? The rogue bear had backed off. That almost never happened. And the wolves. Jack's pulse quickened as he remembered the moment the alpha wolf had looked at him. Not with aggression. Not with hunger. With recognition. Jack shook his head. Maybe it was just exhaustion messing with his mind. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, he knew better. Something had shifted. Something unbelievable had happened out there on the ice. And whatever it was, he wasn't alone anymore. Jack closed his eyes, his grip tightening around the small cub nestled against his chest. No matter what came next, he would fight for the little one. He would not let it die. And he had a feeling. Something, or someone, was watching over them. Outside, beyond the storm, deep in the endless white. The wolves were waiting. Jack woke to the sound of silence. For a moment, disoriented, he thought he had gone deaf. The storm that had howled all night had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost unnatural. The fire had died down to embers, and the cave was filled with the dim, bluish glow of the Arctic dawn filtering through the ice. His body ached, stiff and sore from the cold, but he was alive. And so was the cub. Jack glanced down. The tiny bear was nestled against his chest, its small, round ears twitching as it took slow, steady breaths. Its fur had dried overnight, and while it was still dangerously weak, it was alive. He exhaled, running a hand gently over the cub's fragile frame. "You're tougher than you look, little one," he murmured. But their fight wasn't over yet. Jack had to get moving. The longer they stayed out here, the slimmer their chances of survival became. He needed to reach his base camp, where he had food, shelter, and supplies. But there was one problem. The wolves. He knew they were out there, watching. Jack shifted carefully, trying not to disturb the cub. He moved toward the cave entrance, peering out. The landscape was blindingly white, stretching endlessly in all directions. The storm had buried much of the ice in fresh snow, making it nearly impossible to see the cracks and weaknesses beneath. And then, he saw them. A dark line of figures, standing motionless against the horizon. The wolves. Jack's breath caught in his throat. There were at least 7 of them, silent, still, their eyes locked on him. Watching. Waiting. Jack had encountered wolves before, but never like this. They weren't acting like predators on the hunt. There was no aggression, no attempt to encircle him. They were waiting for him to move. Jack swallowed hard. Every instinct told him to be cautious. But something deep in his gut told him these wolves weren't here to kill him. They had bowed to him last night. He still didn't understand why, but one thing was clear: something had changed. Jack adjusted the cub in his arms and took a slow, deliberate step forward. The wolves didn't move. Another step. Still, they stood their ground. Then, as if answering some unspoken command, the largest wolf, the alpha, turned and began to walk. The others followed. Jack's heart pounded. They weren't attacking. They weren't running away. They were leading him. Jack hesitated only for a second. Then, gripping the cub tighter against his chest, he stepped forward, following the wolves into the vast, frozen wilderness. He didn't know where they were taking him. He didn't know why they had chosen him. But something told him. This was only the beginning. Jack followed the wolves across the frozen wasteland, each step crunching against the thick snow. The cub stirred in his arms but remained weak, its small body barely warm. His own strength was waning, his limbs stiff, his vision blurring from exhaustion and the unrelenting cold. But something kept him moving. The wolves led him with purpose, their dark forms weaving through the endless white, heading towards something unseen. Jack had stopped questioning why they hadn't attacked him, why they seemed to be guiding him. He just knew, deep in his gut, that he had to follow. Then, he saw it. A massive shadow rising in the distance, its edges sharp against the icy blue sky. A formation of jagged ice, a hidden cave. The alpha wolf stopped at the entrance and turned, its yellow eyes locking onto Jack's. Jack hesitated. Was this a trap? A den filled with more wolves? He had no choice. The cub was slipping away. If there was any chance, any hope, he had to take it. Jack stepped forward. Inside, the air was different, still cold, but shielded from the brutal winds outside. The wolves filtered in behind him, circling the edges of the cavern. And then, he saw her. A towering figure, her white fur blending seamlessly with the ice. A polar bear. Jack's breath caught in his throat. She was massive, easily twice his size, her presence filling the cave with quiet dominance. And yet, she didn't charge. Didn't roar. She only watched. Jack slowly knelt, placing the cub onto the icy ground between them. His fingers trembled as he pulled back. The mother bear took a step forward. Jack barely breathed as she lowered her massive head, sniffing the small, fragile bundle. Then, a sound. A deep, rumbling noise, not a growl, but something else. A recognition. A mother's call. The cub let out a weak, trembling cry. And then, it moved. For the first time since Jack had found it, it tried to stand. Jack's chest tightened as he watched the cub stumble forward, pressing its tiny body against the mother's thick fur. It had found her. It had survived. Jack exhaled, the weight in his chest lifting in a way he hadn't expected. The wolves, silent witnesses, began to retreat, melting into the shadows of the ice. Jack met the mother bear's eyes one last time. No hostility. No threat. Only an understanding. A silent thank you. Jack stepped back. It was time to go. As he turned, walking out into the vast, frozen wilderness, the storm clouds began to clear, revealing the endless Arctic sky. And for the first time in days, Jack felt warm.